Welcome back, everyone. This session we've got a familiar face and a new face in the trainers, so you'll recognize Jules from prior weeks. Joining us this time is Simone, joining us from the Caribbean, but she's worked all over, so if you haven't read her bio yet, go check it out. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Simone.
Hi. Thanks, Jeff. Good morning, good afternoon, good night, everybody. This session is on the ICP 17 Capital Adequacy, which is one of the tools which regulators have to prevent failure or mitigate the impact of insurance company failures. Jules and I are both excited to be here with you, and we really hope you'll find this session useful to you in your work. It is a 90-minute session, which is relatively long, and we appreciate this is your third week of training. So Jules and I will interchange sections, and we will have some discussion breakouts, which we're hoping that you will use this time to brainstorm freely in groups and highlight to us what a couple of the main takeaways were for you. So specifically, we have the first section, which is a review of the core concepts of regulatory capital adequacy. Trying to get my mouse back on the other screen. What are the capital requirements, the insurer's resources, what type of risk are explicitly accounted for, and how the supervisory ladder works. These concepts would have been presented in the video by Jules, and we hope you've had a chance to review that video, as we hope the purpose of this section is to clarify and deep dive on a few of the concepts. But please, let us know your questions, and we will try our best to answer them, and we can go over information from the video as needed. The second section is more about some practical, and the second and the third section is about more practical considerations. Section 2 is on the building out the framework, where the concept of proportionality is discussed, and it's extremely important, especially in jurisdictions with less resources. So we talk about how proportionality can be used to address practical challenges, which often prevent regulators from moving to a risk-based framework or just generally improving their frameworks. Section 3, capital adequacy in context, where we highlight again that capital adequacy is only one defense mechanism to prevent failures, and we get into that in more detail. Again, we hope this discussion will be of use to you and will pique your interest to ask questions of us and brainstorm together. We'll do our best. We may not have comprehensive answers today to all your questions, but we'll get back to you if we don't. And so now I will hand it over to Jules for the first section.
Right, let me see if the take control bit works. I've just pressed it. Look, what happens next? Oh, I can see that. There we go. Good. So, as Simone said, welcome to everybody, and I echo Simone's comments about being pleased to be here and looking forward to your questions. We'll see where that takes us. So, what I want to do at the minute is I want to sit back and just review some of the concepts and move on from defining the tool of capital adequacy to actually using the tool. And as we all know, there's a big difference between having a tool and then knowing how to use it. So first I want to step back and look at the bigger picture and see how capital adequacy fits into that picture. So insurance supervision is essentially about reducing the risk of an insurer not being able to meet its obligations, long and short term, and in particular to policyholders. So when a supervisor determines that an insurer can't do this, so that means the supervisor determines the insurer has become insolvent from the supervisor's perspective, that should trigger actions to exit the insurer from the market in an orderly way, and that minimises impacts on policyholders and starts a resolution process. So that's a fairly tough outcome, and I'm sure you can see there are lots of considerations and practical steps that the supervisor needs to decide on before they put an insurer into resolution. And I've just used the word solvency, and you need to be careful when you use that word, or solvent, because it means different things to different people. So if you ask an accountant, you'll get a different answer than if you ask an actuary. So in the context I'm talking about, it is when a supervisor decides that a company is not going to be viable going forward. It has then become insolvent from the supervisory perspective. This is quite a conservative position, so I'm going to call it regulatory insolvency, and that differentiates it from other things like cash flow solvency, which is not good enough. And just as a silly example, a Ponzi scheme is solvent in the cash flow sense, at least until it falls over. So that's not a good place to be. And it's different from wind-up solvency as well. So just bear in mind that what we're talking about here when we discuss solvency is this regulatory solvency, and that's when the supervisor decides the company's not viable going forward. So insurers can fail for lots of reasons, as I think you heard in Fred's webinar. And some of those reasons are financially based, but many are not. And especially when you look at the underlying causes of the insolvency as opposed to the immediate ones. So I just want you to be aware that whilst financial considerations are important in this context of solvency, there are other things that can also give you headaches. Now, best practice supervision is moving away from rules-based approach to a principles and risk-based approach. And the plus of this is it can be better tailored to the risk profile of each insurer. The minus is it tends to become more complex and require more supervisory judgment than a rules or compliance-based approach. So coming back to CapAd, minimum capital requirements provide the supervisor with information about an insurer's regulatory solvency position, and taking a risk-based supervision approach, it makes a lot of sense to also then take a risk-based approach to capital requirements. The expected benefit being that an insurer's capital requirements reflect the risks the insurer is taking, not just an average over the industry. And obviously there are lots more nuances to think about than that. So basically it all gets complicated, but the basic idea is to try in risk-based capital is to reflect the risks of the company, and the basic idea of risk-based supervision is to reflect the risks the company's facing overall. Hang on, let's try that one. So just as a reminder, we've talked about regulatory capital requirements and that being at a sufficient level so that in adversity, the insurer's obligations to policyholders will continue to be met as they fall due. There's a bunch of key words sitting in here. So sufficient level, in adversity is important because it indicates an attitude, and note policyholder obligations to policyholders. That doesn't include shareholders and other stakeholders, and continue to be met as they fall due, not sometime later when you feel like it. So the ICP itself says the supervisor establishes capital adequacy requirements for solvency purposes, not for other purposes, so the insurer can absorb significant unforeseen losses. So this is very conservative perspective, and it's a single perspective of solvency purposes. And it also is to provide for degrees of supervisory intervention. So there are two jobs that capital adequacy is doing. One is absorbing losses and making everybody more comfortable, and the second is providing for degrees of supervisory intervention. I'll get used to this one of these days. So in terms of capital adequacy and the capital side of it, it really means determining the capital requirements. That's what you need to hold and is specified by the supervisor on the one hand. And on the other hand, you look at the capital resources and that's what you've got. And you really hope that what you've got available is bigger than what you need. Otherwise, you've got a problem to start with. And that's all brought together in the coverage ratio, which is the resources divided by the requirements. So what you're really after is that ratio being bigger than 1, obviously. And the question you have to ask is, that's fine, but how much bigger? And we'll come back to that a little bit at the moment. But what I will say is that typically it needs to be quite a lot bigger than 1. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One is that there's usually an at all times requirement imposed on insurers. That is, they have to meet the CapAd requirements at all times. So you don't want to get messed up by inadvertent little variations that come through. And the second key aspect is that there are other reasons why insurers hold capital than just to meet the solvency requirements that the regulator imposes. So if they want to do other things in addition to meeting the requirements, they're going to need to hold more capital. So in my experience, and others may have a different experience, but the ratios in Australia for life insurance and general insurance are typically between and about 1.8. So X is 0.8 roughly in Australia. It moves up and down a bit, but you can see it's significantly bigger than just 1. And from a supervisory point of view, clearly you need to be monitoring trends of the coverage ratios and also the resources and requirements, because they give you clues from a historical point of view, at least of what might be happening. So I want to spend a bit of time on this slide, if I may, because it covers off both the first part of ICP 17, the calculations, and the second part, the intervention triggers, which is the little ladder on the right. It's a little ladder, but it has a big impact. So if I look at the left of the picture for a minute, I start off in a business as usual environment, which is usually where insurers are, best estimates and all that sort of stuff. And in the blue, you've got assets. And on the other side, the second column, you've got other liabilities, which are not insurance liabilities. Then you have your current estimates, which are your best estimates. Just current estimates is IAIS speak for best estimates. The orange gives you a risk margin that you hold, so it's already conservative. And what's left after that is typically called capital in a business as usual context. So if you now move across the vertical blue line, you move into a stress scenario, and that's the environment in which capital adequacy calculations are done. Remember the in adversity comment. So what happens there is that the IAS suggests that you recompute the current estimates, but in using the impact of the stresses. So the green box gets a bit bigger, and similarly the orange box will get a bit bigger as well, because adverse circumstances are at play. And then you have a yellow box on top of that, which is some mechanism for determining some additional capital requirements. The step in the yellow box is because often when you talk about it at the end of the day, you talk about the amount of capital required relative to the increase over the business as usual risk margin, and that's a bigger number than the capital required over the new risk margin computed in adverse circumstances. It's a bit of a mess, but that's just the way people talk about it. So that gives you your capital required, what you need. Then you move to the next column, the fourth one across, and you look at how much you want, the capital resources. And again, really what happens here is that there are some assets that the company holds, you can see on the left-hand side, that are excluded from the assets you're allowed to count toward capital resources. And that's because those excluded resources aren't considered appropriate for the purpose of capital adequacy and solvency. All right, they may be quite fine for other purposes, but not for that. So again, you've got in the blue on the right, the assets, and then the capital resources above that. Again, just set up so you can measure it against the original business as usual risk margin. And what you need is that your capital resources plus assets are bigger than your capital required plus the liabilities, and that your capital resources are bigger than the capital required, which is what the picture shows. Now that deals with the calculation of the capital adequacy. Now I want to focus on the second purpose of ICP 17, which is, I'm sure you all remember, setting up intervention triggers for the supervisor. So the prudential supervision ladder is on the far right, the little brown one. And as I said, it's a small picture, but it has a big impact. So supervisors should set up some solvency control levels that trigger supervisory intervention into an insurer's affairs when the insurer is not or is expected not to be capitally adequate. So what happens here is, and there are two levels proposed for these control levels. One is the top one, the PCR, which has the green dotted horizontal line. and that's the higher of these control levels. And it should be set at a level where the supervisor would not generally intervene in the company on capital adequacy grounds. It might intervene on other grounds, but not on cap ad grounds. And the PCR should include the full capital requirement. You notice that the green dotted line goes across the top of the required capital in the third column. And if an insurer breaches this prescribed capital requirement, then the supervisor starts getting interested, basically. And it will consider intervention, and it would have a set of tools and steps it might take, sort of conceptually listed on that supervisory ladder. And as the breach worsens, the supervisor would apply stronger tools. So these actions can be listed, and they should be of increasing strength as the capital resources decline. And it's a useful thing to do for supervisors to make it clear to their industries what sort of things are on those ladders. Not to promise they'll do certain things at certain times, but then at least insurers know what might happen if they start getting into trouble. At the bottom of the supervisory ladder, you have the lower of these two control levels. It's called the minimum capital requirement, the MCR. And if you breach the MCR, then what is happening is the supervisor is saying, I don't think that you will be a viable insurer going forward. So it's a very serious thing to breach the MCR, and you don't want to be there. But notice that the MCR, that red dotted line, is still above the current estimates, either under the business as usual or the stress current estimates. So there is still conservatism and funding, some funding left within the company to meet its policyholder obligations. But what the supervisor is saying is not enough. So just remember that that supervisory ladder, because this actually is the first application of the capital adequacy tool, because it determining the PCR and the MCR, and then the moving up and down this ladder here is actually using it. So it's the first step forward. So I'll just refresh you a bit, on capital requirements. That the yellow box in the third column we had last time. And there are a range of ways of computing these or determining these. They range, according to the red arrow, from really simple, which is a plus, and blunt, which is probably not a plus, all the way across to the other side, where they can be very complicated and very refined and very sophisticated and very hard to follow, basically. So on the simple side, you've got just a flat dollar figure. So it's a one size fits all, and the supervisor says, okay, every insurer, or every life insurer or general insurer, here's how much additional capital you'll hold, like $10 million or whatever it is. So as I said, simple's nice, but maybe not very effective. And then you move, as you move toward the right, by taking an approach that says, we'll have some factors and, we'll have some factors and we'll have some proxies for risk. So that proxies could be things like size of liabilities or amount of premium or claims. Typically, they're things you can get from the accounts. So they're well balanced. You multiply those proxies by some factors. So it could be 4% times liabilities plus 2% times premiums. It's that sort of style of measurement. And that has some risk reflection of what's happening in the company in it, because they'll have different types of liabilities, they'll have different types of claims and different types of premiums. So it does become somewhat reflect risk-based. Those things may have flat dollar floors applied to them. So, for example, it might be you're not allowed to have negative numbers in your summation, and so on. And then the next level of sophistication is where you look at those risk proxies and the factors and you say, well, maybe they're dependent on each other. So you introduce diversification, which is a correlation matrix. So you avoid the premise that you have when you look at it without diversification, that all risks are 100% correlated because you add them. And that's not real. So either you do it directly in a diversification correlation matrix, or you do it indirectly by having smaller factors where it becomes implicit. But these are quite manageable. This approach here, factors time proxies, that's Solvency 1. And then you move on and you now have diversification matrices, which a lot of people do now, including the ICS, the IAIS has put out, and various other places. You can then move on, if you wish, to having individual models which are held by the insurer, built by the insurer and approved by the supervisor. And that's a fundamental shift, because up until you get to this right-hand side, in effect, the model you use for computing capital is determined by the supervisor and implemented by the insurer. So individual models, the theory is they're very precise and very risk reflective, but they're really hard to supervise, because how do you know whether it's doing what it's supposed to do? And certainly in some areas, like operational risk, is the diversity of results that are coming out is saying it's not working, and supervisors are walking back from internal models back to something they can control and they can get consistency of results. But so just there's a range of ways in which you can compute risk-based capital. And I think the one piece of advice, if I may, to offer to you is don't get too complicated. Do something you can make work and you know what's happening, and then make it more risk responsive perhaps as you go forward if you need it. And capital resources, we talked about this in the video. They're typically split up into tiers with the best stuff in tier 1. And you can see the number of criteria that it has to abide by. The next level down, tier 2, are lower quality resources, so they're not as good, and usually limits are going to apply. So whilst this looks simple on a slide, actually determining it is hard, and there's always lots of debate. So don't underestimate the difficulty of specifying what a capital resource and what are allowed and what are not. And I think that brings me to the end. Yes, it does. So I did check the forum before this meeting, and there are no questions there, so that's an easy one. And I guess we can look at whether there are any audience questions, and which, looking at the chat room, there aren't any there either that I can see. Yep, no, there aren't. So I think, Simone,
Yeah, that
if
was
I've run
great.
overtime, then we can move on to the next part of the game.
Right. So we're going to go into some breakout sessions just to discuss some of those key concepts, and maybe you'll feel free to ask any questions there, because there'll be a smaller groups, or you can highlight a point that you heard on the video that was not emphasized. So who will be taking us into the breakout rooms? Jeff, who?
Yeah,
I
that's-
know, but I think, do we want to show the question quickly?
Oh,
On the
right.
next-
So, yes. So I've have some questions here, but they're really more illustrative to think about in the breakout rooms. The concept of total balance sheet approach, Jules didn't develop it really in further on this session, but we can talk about the concept of a total balance sheet approach and what your thoughts are on it, the advantages and disadvantages. Jules mentioned the solvency control levels, and some thoughts that we can discuss are what are the considerations, other considerations in setting the PCR, MCR, and what are the pros and cons of adding additional trigger points. Those are just illustrated, but so we would like the session to be where you want it to go. So, but there are some thoughts to help you to think about. And we would like you just to come back with 1 or 2 takeaways from your group. You're going to have about 5 to 8 minutes. So if you can look at, think about discussing some of these points or any points you wish, and coming back with us to us with 1 or 2 takeaways on a voluntary basis. So that was good. We had some good questions on PCR, MCR, like what are some of the considerations in setting the MCR? And we talked a little bit, deep dive a little bit about where do you start? You know, if you're getting started into risk-based capital framework, do you keep it simple and apply something across the board. And we got into there was a comment that there are pros and cons to that, which we'll get into in section 2. Anybody want to mention any other takeaways or? Okay, we're behind time a bit, so I'm going to head over to section 2, and we can, the next breakout room is at the end of section 3, and we can pick back up on some of these thoughts there as well. Is that okay? Can we? Okay. For the next section, you know, we're going to be discussing some practical considerations in the application and design of a capital adequacy framework. A key concept which is embedded throughout the ICPs is the concept of proportionality. So I'll be zoning in on this a bit. The ICPs establish minimum requirements for effective supervision, and they are expected to be implemented and applied in a proportionate manner. And this is the idea where it is understood that you're imposing requirements on insurers that will achieve prudential objectives, but you don't want them to be unnecessarily onerous. So this is a quote up here from one of the BIS documents, which is very useful, I find. And it's a subject I like to focus on because in the Caribbean, we have a lot of countries who are still on a flat minimums. We have the bigger islands, which have adopted risk-based frameworks mirroring the structure of Canada. But then for some of the other players, they're kind of in a stalemate situation. And I think part of the reason there's a lot of indecision is because of the relative speed at which the Holy Grail risk-based frameworks continue to evolve. And they're the widely referenced ones, the Canadian LICAT or Solvency II. And also the fact that some of the jurisdictions are not homogeneous. They have a wide range of players. So a one-size-fit-all risk-based framework, it doesn't always, it's not always optimal. And a more tiered, proportionate approach may be the best way to start out. And this is not always easy to do, but it's actually sometimes the optimal way to go. So I'm going to switch to this slide. So the reality is that there are a lot of considerations in the design of a risk-based capital framework. Most jurisdictions, if not all, want their capital framework to be compliant, ICP 17 compliant, but they also, one desires quality is it for it to be proportionate, meaning that you want to subject smaller or less complex insurers to simplified requirements that still achieve prudential objectives, but you don't want them to be unduly burdensome. So you want the framework. Proportionality allows a framework to still enhance financial stability without impeding growth unnecessarily. That is, it should strike the appropriate balance between the policyholder protection and industry growth. And this is also using the IAIS principle of proportionality. There are the other dimensions, objectives are on adequacy and calibration. You know, the principles do not actually state where you should be calibrated to. It leaves it to the jurisdictions to think about their risk in their market and other competitive or growth pressures. And often what you find is that the confidence level or the calibration point considers what other peer jurisdictions are doing. Also, other financial institutions which have similar risk types to avoid capital arbitrage. So, for example, interest rate risk and credit risk, the calibration also needs to consider how the regulator might set capital requirements for banks. Because in some countries, the capital requirements might be already developed for banks, more developed or more risk-based for banks, and the insurance requirements are lagging. So when you're setting it up, you want to be careful to double check what is being done on the banking side for similar risks like credit risk. And then, of course, being consistent. So for example, in the Caribbean, we have regions that are considering, have nothing in currently, but they're considering what, you know, the other countries such as Jamaica and Trinidad are currently doing. But that might not necessarily fit them because their range of players are different. And so I'll get into that a little bit. Okay. So I mentioned that in the Caribbean, the Canadian risk-based framework is often the most referenced framework, but it's not proportional in the sense that all insurers need to apply the same risk-based capital framework regardless of their size or the complexity. So this type of risk-based framework works well for jurisdictions which have a more homogeneous domestic market, but it's a challenge for other islands which have a range of players from captive to small to large domestics and international reinsurers. These are all sectors which they want to keep in the country, and they want to be able to address their needs and their various risks. And sometimes just choosing one framework will not, one risk-based framework will not do it all. For example, you know, you can have under the standardized approach, you can have a 4-factor, say, this is just illustrating, a 4-factor standardized model, which will not be adequately risk sensitive or prudential for all. And then you can also have a blanket 20-factor, more risk sensitive standardized model, which takes 3 times the effort and maybe overly onerous for some of the smaller players. So perhaps a starting point may be a tiered approach. So I also want to emphasize that you can have a risk-based, it can still be risk-based and also proportional. So we talked about risk-based, the incentives for risk-based, it's incentive for better risk management, reduce the likelihood of company insolvencies, it's aligned with ICP, international capital standards, ability to better regulate the system and financial system when the risks are better match the capital allocation. So we want to keep all of that. Some of the cons are it can be difficult to calibrate, and it's challenging for small insurers and captives as efforts may not be commensurate with the level of risk. There are different valuation standards. Large insurers already have their own capital models and they want to stick to them, and they don't necessarily want to have to follow a simpler capital model just to exist just to do business in the environment. So we have some regulators that are playing with various demands and different risk profiles. So the flip side, you know, of the challenge is for insurance regulators to find the right balance in setting rules or coming up with a tiered approach that are sufficient to achieve prudential aims and also meet the needs, the risk profile of the different players in their country. So I want to also emphasize that a proportionate solvency framework should not be misunderstood to mean relaxing the rules. In fact, some regulators may consider accompanying simplification with additional stringency. And the framework could also provide regulators with the necessary flexibility to apply the fuller set of standard rules to eligible insurers, even if they meet the correct criteria for simplified rules. But this is not a simple task to develop a proportional framework. You need to consider critical issues. These include appropriately selecting the eligibility criteria for those insurers eligible for simplified regulatory requirements to effectively manage the trade-off between simplification and risk sensitivity. But this is one way to allow all the players to continue to operate in the same country, because sometimes one risk-based approach will kill some sectors, and you will see some needed sectors. So there's sometimes small domestic players that are, you know, providing a need such as funeral insurance, and you want to be able to make sure that, you know, they prosper for the needs of the population as well. So this table that you have here, you can see that it's showing you that there are various regulatory approaches currently to proportionate solvency regulation. There's no internationally agreed definition of proportionality in the context of capital standards, but so this has led to jurisdiction interpreting this concept differently. For example, you have in this example, Singapore They have a standardized risk-based framework, but they also allow certain types of insurers, such as marine mutual insurers, which are eligible for a more simplified solvency regime. I'm not sure if they've evolved since then, as it's currently always evolving. And then even more recently, Solvency II, EIOPA, they are refining their requirements to identify lower risk profile insurers eligible for a simplified framework or exemptions. And these criteria are not just based on size, but level of guarantees, border reach. So different elements that might make the insurer a more complex risk profile. So I just want to say, as mentioned, we sometimes when you're using a simpler approach, the expectation is not for it to be materially different a result. It can sometimes actually be higher. But the idea is to reduce the burden on these smaller players in terms of the resources, the number of people, the amount of time that is required to come up with, to calculate the capital requirements. I think in France, there's still an exemption for calculating the diversification benefit within a risk category if the resulting capital requirements is at least as prudent, you know. And you see it across other countries, not just Singapore, but South Africa, Sweden, and I mentioned France, they all have elements of proportionality. So I just wanted to mention this, that we don't want necessarily to hear the word risk-based and think, okay, that will never work. You can still within develop a comprehensive framework where you have different types of models for the type of insurer. The challenge is to come up with those eligibility criteria, but I think it is worth the effort because it allows the growth of the insurance sector, allows for competition. If you can identify, criteria which will suit different players in your market. And as I referenced the IOPA document, which has examples of criteria of which type of insurers can be considered less complex and maybe suitable for a very simple, something just above a flat minimum type of solvency requirement, still somewhat risk-based, but not to the extent where it has multiple factors or takes more than a week to calculate. And I've been putting this message out in the Caribbean to hopefully encourage some of our jurisdictions to start looking into it, because it's not that they have to come up with something to please they're challenged with pleasing everybody, but this is still one way of meeting their prudential objectives. So we're gonna go to section 3, and we can have our questions after section 3. And this is where we introduce a concept that maintaining sufficient capital resources alone is not sufficient protection for policyholders, because they're in the absence of a disciplined and effective risk management policies and procedures. So this is the real underpinning. I think capital can be seen as a line of defense, but it's not the first, and sometimes not even the second. We want to make sure that there's appropriate risk management governance, which is what Jules will be getting into. And that's it. Are we? Jules, do you want to take over at this point?
Yeah, sure. Let me press the take control button. Oh yeah, things are happening. Okay, so there's the slide that you spoke to but didn't get there. So we'll go to section 3 and talk about cap adding context. So I really want to just draw out a couple of, in a sense, simple things. And in each of the following 3 slides, I'm picking up on some of the points I introduced at the beginning of the session on slide 4. So we've seen that capital is a necessary condition for solvency. That is, not having enough regulatory capital and in particular, breaching the MCR is a condition for regulatory insolvency. So it's definitely a necessary condition. I think you need to also recognise that it's not a sufficient condition. So, as you've said, insurers can fail for a broad range of reasons, and there are many examples of failed insurers not formally breaching their regulatory capital requirements. something else went wrong than not having enough capital. And in that sense, I'm sure you can think of a scenario where capital adequacy requirements are met, but liquidity requirements are not, and vice versa. So if you don't meet the liquidity requirements, you can't pay people out on time. And a very simple example of that, just to draw it out, might be somebody who owns a house and they're going to use that as a basis for their retirement. So they've got the capital because they could sell it, but they're illiquid. They can't go and sell a corner of a room to pay for the groceries this week because you can't do that. So they would starve because of being illiquid. So having capital available can certainly help manage adverse events, and it clearly buys time for other actions to be taken. But we need to recognise there are limits on the amount of capital that can be required or held, and so there's a limited supply of capital, and that means there's a limited amount of time it can buy. And we'll make the point that getting more capital can be difficult. So the capacity of a stressed insurer to be able to raise more capital in the marketplace, assuming it's able to, that is, it's got the right structure to do that, under reasonable conditions, can be very limited in practice, because everybody knows they're under stress, they'll charge for it. And if an insurer is part of a larger group, the willingness or capacity of other parts of that group, which may be international and may not, to provide capital are unlikely to be guaranteed. And if you have a global stress, and we've seen this, it's everybody for themselves. So we need to keep CapAd in context, and it's an important part of assessing solvency, and it's a necessary condition for solvency, but there are constraints around how it may be completely effective. Simone, do you want to add anything?
No, we can wait to the end. I do have some questions, so keep it going.
Okay. I'll find the next slide. So I introduced in the video this concept of a supervisory stool, and just stepping back from that a bit, there's a couple of conclusions that can come out. And as we said, insurers can fail for a broad range of reasons. And that's not surprising because they take on and face a broad range of risks. Indeed, they've got to face risks because if they don't have an insurance business. So from a supervisory perspective, the challenge is to identify the material risks as well as possible and then to mitigate them. And just as an aside, sometimes you see the statement made of, we'll address all risks. That's a really silly statement because it presumes you know what they all are, which you don't because the risk scenario evolves, and it needs a sort of materiality constraint applied to it. So when you see something that says, we'll address all identified material risks, then you know you've got an understanding of the environment and it's moving. So, and as I said, it's moving. So I mean, think of COVID-19, climate change, cyber risks. 10 years ago, those weren't counted as material and they weren't being addressed by insurers. Now they all are. So risk-based supervision therefore needs an approach that takes into account all these risks and in an appropriate way. That approach should be over the full set of risks, not just looking at each of them individually. And so some risks are also dependent on others, and risk events, as opposed to risk mitigation, risk events, once they've occurred, have their own risk profile, and that can change over time. So you need to be, as supervisors, aware of this set of individual risks and also how they behave as a group in a portfolio. And we all know that portfolios behave differently than their individual components. And just think about investment portfolios. So what supervisors need is a way to obtain an overall assessment of the risks in aggregate posed by that insurer so they can then prioritise their activities because supervisors have limited resources. So you've got to work out where you're going to focus. And capital adequacy is certainly a tool for this, but it is, as we said before, part of a broader picture. And I've just listed. Oh, that's the wrong page. Hang on. That's why it doesn't make any sense. And in the webinar, I mentioned a supervisory stool, and there's a little one there which has a table on top to sit on, or for the insurer to be on, and the legs are joined together. And that represents the fact that these risks interact with each other and they don't exist in isolation. And the primary legs of this stool are the prudential leg, which is usually focused on financial stuff, and capital adequacy will live in that as part of solvency in the narrow sense of it. There's market conduct, which is how you behave with customers and so on. And then there's governance and risk management as a third leg. But they all interact with each other. And I think perhaps the key message is that while CapAd and other financial requirements, such as liquidity, are important elements of the risk portfolios, they're not the full portfolio. So all these pieces need to be viewed as perhaps a little amorphous mass of risks all running around the bottom of a Petri dish. And what you need to be doing as supervisors is understanding how they're going to come together. And the last bit I wanted to just phrase in this bigger context is resolution. Now, we've touched on this because we've talked about the supervisory ladder, and this is really the question about what happens when you get to the bottom of the supervisory ladder. Because at that point, the insurer is not considered to be viable to continue into the future. So breaching the MCR is certainly one path to become not viable, but there are other paths as well. So again, the capital part and the capital route is important, but it's not the only route. So keep them in balance. And it means that supervisory powers to trigger insolvency decisions are also important. So supervisors need processes in place to support making the exit from the industry orderly, and especially for policyholders. And these processes should be set up before the event occurs, so you're not inventing them on the fly, because that doesn't work well. And capital requirements play an important role here, but not the only role. So that means there's some consequences of that. And it means that the determination of the MCR should not be subject to debate. And so it may need to be clearly and unambiguously defined, and that may mean it's more deterministic. The supervisors don't want to be caught up in a debate about whether the MCR has or has not been breached if they want to take actions based on it being breached. And, you know, it also may be the case in these situations that insurers may not be as cooperative as they might be otherwise. So, you know, in a sense, a measure of effectiveness of CapAd requirements could be the clarity with which they can be applied as a regulatory insolvency trigger. Now, you need to be thinking about, you know, what can go wrong when you want to move into this insolvency place, when you want to move into resolution. And the management of resolution is a subject in its own right. And as I said, with CapAd breaches being one of the doors that enter you into that room. However, the link is tighter, and the approach to setting CapAd requirements impacts how resolution processes may work, and equally desired resolution approaches may influence the setting of CapAd requirements. So I'm not proposing to go into detail on this. The IAIS has published in the last 4 or 5 years a number of papers talking about resolution and identifying the issues. So it's a bit of a new topic in its own right, but I do think it's important that you're aware of it and that it has links to capital adequacy requirements and how you calibrate them. So that's what I wanted to say, Simone. So what would you like to add?
I think just a couple comments, like on liquidity risk. You know, I think that for me it's analogous to like a bleed, meaning that it's almost a symptom. All these different underlying risks, like whether it's climate change or triggers, credit risk, catastrophes, you know, they can all result in reputational risk and result in a liquidity event, which is basically the outcome of a risk event that you hope that your risk management measures would actually try to prevent from happening. I don't categorize liquidity necessarily as one of those core risk types, but just basically the outcome of something potentially being mismanaged or some unforeseen event happening. So one of the reasons, you don't always see it in the core one, pillar one capital requirements is because of the nature of it. And also it's very hard to come up with effective tool to quantify it for all insurers, to have a standardized approach to it in pillar one. So you often see it in more stress testing type approaches and within ORSA, where the insurer can actually look and see what type of business they have and develop the appropriate liquidity risk management stresses and protocols. The other thing, we talked about certain resolution. Right, I think I mentioned this in one of the breakout rooms on the triggers. We have a supervisory ladder, but one of the things you want to be aware of is that it shouldn't be just treated like an on and off switch. These should also be the actions of an insurer should probably take into account of the action of the regulation, should take into account the nature of the breach, the expected speed at which it can deteriorate as well. So it sometimes a prescriptive rules on triggers may not always be appropriate. I think those are just kind of two comments I had. I know we want to go into breakout rooms and we can try to decide which areas we want to further discuss on all of this presentation, I believe. Right? Does that sound good?
There's also a comment in chat. I don't know if Jules and Simone, I don't know if you've had a chance to go into chat and see Tesla's question. I think you've sort of answered it indirectly.
Then what are these qualitative factors and how to quantify them? Okay, I'll read it from the start. It is mentioned that capital adequacy and solvency margin is different in that solvency considers some qualitative aspects, correct? Then what are these qualitative factors and how to quantify them so as to arrive at a figure that, yes, that represent a calculated quantitative solvency margin, right? Jules, you want to take a first crack on it?
I think what this means, I was alluding to this when I was talking about the portfolio of risks that an insurer faces and the need, therefore, for the supervisor to make an assessment of that portfolio. So just to draw another analogy, the individual risks are a bit like various feet on the bottom of a duck, paddling in all sorts of different directions. And the portfolio is what the duck's doing above water, which may be sailing along very nicely. So you have to dig into what's going on. And many supervisors have a process whereby, let me see how to put this. If you like simplicity, they list off all the risks they can identify. So they would have governance risks, they'd have financial risks, they'd have risks from poor market conduct, whatever. So they have a bunch of these, and in a simplistic sense, you can assess each of those risks as being high, medium, or low, or whatever grade you want to attach to them. And then you treat those as the set of little items at the bottom of a pyramid, and you aggregate them up. So you look at two risks and say, well, this one's medium and this one's low, but if I consider them together, it comes out as medium for sake of argument, right? You have to design the process. But then you've aggregated two risks into one reading, and you keep doing that repeatedly, and you can come to the top of it and you'll have an aggregate answer. That's not necessarily an average, but it's an aggregate. And if you apply the same process to a range of insurers, some, when you look at these aggregate results, will be very risky and some will be much less risky. And that's your mechanism for prioritizing where you would put your focus. So there's a bit more to it than doing that, but that's essentially what risk assessment profiles for more established supervisors do. And there's public information out there about it. APRA in Australia has it. I know OSFI does in Canada and so on, but the game plan behind all of that is relatively simple. It is look at all the risks you've got in isolation, find a way to quote, add, unquote, add them up so that you can get a single result and do it. And then that drives how you as a supervisor are able to prioritize your activities. And one of the things you can do in that sort of process is you can you put gates on it. So if it, by which I mean, in some cases you would say, if a risk turns out to be very high, then that's sufficiently important that that very high has to carry all the way up to the top of the process so that you attend to it. So that's how I do it. And you can do this on a qualitative basis or a quantitative basis. So everybody can be involved, and the ability of a group of people with experience to come up with a good assessment of the impact of a risk, whether it's high, medium or low, is actually pretty good. So you don't need to make mathematical models here, and complicated ones don't necessarily help you any, but you do need to be willing to use your experience to make a judgment as to what level of risk in each case is there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll just add to that the stress testing is also a good tool to try to assess the materiality of risk. Not all risk will be able to quantify, not all internal or external threats will be able to be quantified in the solvency margin approach. But then that's where ORSA or stress testing comes into play. You know, there's climate change coming, you know, there's cybersecurity risks. You can play out some scenarios and see how that would impact the insurer's you know, financial stability, our ability to meet the policyholder obligations. So there are many pillars to try to address these risks. There's pillar one, which has been the focus of this, which is the quantitative risk-based capital requirements. But then there's also stress testing, ORSA, and then also just disclosure to public regulators as well. And it's a challenge. I mean, I just did a, go ahead, Jules.
I was going to say another comment to make here is that I think this all comes across as sounding very complicated and difficult to do. And that's certainly true in some cases. It certainly can be made that way. But the thing you should take away from this sort of course is not the details of how to do it, but the ideas that are sitting behind it. So just take the ideas away so you're sensitized to them, and you can either go and do more research or you can, you know, employ an expert to do it, but you just need to know enough to be across the basic ideas, and that's far more powerful than you might think.
Right. And there are limitations to the most sophisticated risk-based models out there, and so you always have to use your judgment and think of scenarios which aren't specifically quantified in some of those risk-based capital models. So those are great questions. Jules, do you want to move to the breakouts or?
Sure. So here's a couple of questions for you to consider. You're not required to consider only these. So if you have questions or issues that have come up during the presentation, feel free to bring those up as well. But you might want to just wait a minute and give people a quick chance to read the questions, and then we can go into the breakout.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Okay, I think everybody's, had a chance to read it. So I don't know who's pressing the breakout button, but whoever it is, please press it.
Have fun. See you on the other side.
Oh no.
Oops. It's most interesting.
Yes, that was really interesting. Elias, you can go ahead. Go ahead with your question if you're comfortable.
Yeah.
No, he's
You're
gone.
on mute.
Yeah, good.
Yeah, it's great. It's quite interesting, basically on the South African journey, and this because so for instance, if you look at different risk-based capital regimes across East Africa. So for instance, the Ugandan one, I was the one who was developing that, and also the Rwanda RBC. I was heavily involved in developing that solvency standard. But there is something that has been mentioned in regarding the South African journey, in particular, whereby the smaller companies that could not meet the capital threshold are converting to microinsurance. Maybe as a supervisor, have you thought of regulatory arbitrages? Because one of the key things that supervisors need to be keen about is whereby you don't create regulatory arbitrages when you are setting up the capital standard, so that a company would ideally just maybe get out of the SAM standard that is quite well developed in South Africa, then kind of just get a lower license just for survival. How are you guys dealing with regulatory arbitrage? And that is something that is when you look at the capital standards, a regulator must be keen on.
So Elias, on that one, when it comes to micro insurers, there's actually some limits of there's some maximum limits that you can underwrite as a micro insurer. So it's different from a fully furnished insurance company. So I think the disadvantage with our model is that even your biggest insurers, your old mutuals, they can set up their own micro insurer, whereas the reasons behind introducing this micro insurer was actually to give the smaller guys an opportunity to also play in the just to level the playing field. So to deal with the arbitrage, I think we set up some limits. So I think for funeral you can only insure up to 100,000. That's the maximum, and then for non-life products you can only insure up to 300,000. So those limits will really help.
Yeah, that's true, because so for instance, if you look at different models, particularly for microinsurance, and when you're developing the capital, a risk-based capital type for microinsurance, you need also to look at the limits, which is key. But also, if you look at when you develop a risk-based capital model for microinsurance, there is also what we call the law of large numbers, ideally the impact. So for instance, if a microinsurance company fails, the impact, if you compare that with a very large company, it will be major, because the poor people can make a lot of noise that the regulator did not protect them, and it might have what we call a very big reputational risk to the regulator. So one of the key things that also we do have advocate when you are creating a risk-based capital models for microinsurance, there is also the regulator has to be quite keen in terms of the I would say the focus. The focus needs to be highly on such licenses because of the exposure. At the same time, maybe what you might needed to have informed us, and maybe I can get a comment from you. If a company is transitioning, maybe from a contemporary license, so to micro insurance license, how long do they take to do a cooling off period? Because they might need to have time to do away with the other policies and set into the new license. As a regulator, have you set time, the cooling off period for the policies to run off, and then they can ideally get into this, or basically it's just something that you would jump in?
No. Yeah, so actually, if you're coming in and you want to convert into a micro insurer and you've been conducting the insurance business that is of high risk, obviously we need to transfer those businesses first before we can convert you. So I think we've converted one, if not two, to date, and those they've always been playing under the policies that are very low in terms of the risk. So when we assessed the products that they've been conducting under the old license. So those products meet the definitions of a microinsurance product.
How long does that process take? Guys, the reason why we're having this discussion because there's so many the regulators that might need to get this experience, because currently there's a lot of traction on microinsurance. How long did that process take? For instance, the conversion.
So the conversion, I think it ran for over close to 2 years. I think it was close to 2 years. The conversion process. Yeah.
I think I've
Thanks.
opened up a whole new session, but the where it was going, we were talking about how critical it is to try to figure out what are the eligibility criteria for a simplified framework, risk-based framework, without introducing capital arbitrage or missing complex risks. It can't be just based on size alone. So that's one of the key takeaways, and not all the answers. It's clearly a discussion in process, but that was one of the focus of our breakout rooms. Does anybody want to jump in on what they were discussing? And in
our group, we learned that in Tunisia they're implementing an RBC at the moment, and maybe the most challenging piece has been the correlation matrix, the calculations involved in determining the correlation of the different risks.
Right.
It's a universal problem.
Right. That's interesting.
Maybe just to maybe comment on Tunisia. Are they looking at other ways of computing the diversification? Because there are a number of formulas. What are they currently using, or because sometimes it's very difficult to get the correlation matrix, particularly in Africa, where data is a little bit scarce and all that.
Exactly. And then in extreme events, correlations tend to 1. I mean, in Canada, it took a long time before they introduced any type of correlations. So go ahead, Elias.
Yeah, are they looking into other simpler methods, such as square root method? Or?
So I think it was Usama that was sharing from Tunisia. Usama, could you unmute or type in chat? Well, there are 3 people from Tunisia, so it was either Usama, Rehab, or Abdesattar.
All right. I don't know, but anyway. So okay. Yeah, maybe you can proceed. Thanks.
No worries.
And Joe.
No worries. So, in Kenya, what did you guys do with correlations? Not to belabor the point, I promise Jules this is the last one. What did you do on correlations in Kenya? Do you have an explicit diversification component in your risk-based capital framework in Kenya?
It's simple square root method. That's basically what we've adopted for, and generally in across East Africa, because we developed a simplified Solvency II standard. It's called the Safari for 8 countries in Eastern Africa. So definitely you'll get Uganda, you'll get Rwanda, Kenya, Tanzania, Malawi. There are already 6 countries that are using that standard called the Safari Solvency Standard that uses a square root approach to determine the diversification. And
again, the square root approach is simply a correlation matrix with 1s on the diagonal.
Yeah.
So if you assume all the risks are independent, then you get a square root approach out of it from a correlation matrix point of view. So it's not different, it's a special case that's simpler, which is fine.
Yeah, and when I worked at OSFI, one of the Alan Brender regulars say that in the tail, it may be independent in ongoing normal circumstances, But when you're dealing with the tail risk for capital requirements, they tend to all gravitate to one, which we saw with the pandemic. You know, I don't think in all our pandemic scenarios we ever envisioned the impact on the asset portfolio, you know? So
just maybe to jump in here, Usama, I hope I pronounced that correctly, just posted on the chat that they are in Tunisia looking at Solvency II as a potential benchmark. And then that maybe it will be additional.
Look at.
Sorry, Jules.
It's a very complicated benchmark to look at.
yes.
So I would actually ask the question of, is it appropriate? Simplified version, as Elias was talking about, might be.
Yeah. And then second, maybe it will be additional in the first steps, zero correlation between the risk, but a correlation matrix then implemented as things progress.
Right. And that's why you see, like, you know, the mix of approaches in one country, because you want something simple for all, which is feasible for all, and then allow or require the more complex or systemic players to develop their internal model and put the burden on them to demonstrate that it's adequate, you know? Because sometimes a simple framework will not be good enough for a country which has 90% of their risk with one player, and then, you know, 3 other players operating in niche markets. You know, you don't want to apply the same framework for all of them. So we end up sometimes what you see regulators doing nothing in that situation, but sometimes coming up with a 2-part framework might be better than doing nothing.
There's also another question from Eugene from the Philippines. I don't know, Eugene, do you want to, because it's quite long, I was wondering, do you want to maybe bring it up yourself if you're able to unmute? Otherwise, I could read it out, but I think it's better if you.
I can try to summarize that they had a law that was based on net worth, the requirement based on net worth, and then more recently they've added an RBC requirement. So they have both requirements, and they're actually losing the number of general insurers because they can't meet the net worth requirement. So do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, first question would be, is that a bad outcome? The implications is a bad outcome, but if you got insurers who can't meet requirements, then rationalise the market might be a good outcome. So it's not clear to me whether I should read this positively or negatively.
Yeah, it's be a function as to whether you think they're onerous, you know, and it's not really clear. It might be actually, you know, something's needed. Yeah.
But it's the old law, the net worth one, that's causing the problem. The RBC one apparently is not.
Oh.
It's not an RBC issue, it's a net worth issue.
Okay.
Well, this has been great. I want to thank, if I can wrap us up, because I see we're over about our usual 5 to 10 minutes over. So I want to thank, you know, Simone, Jules, and Elias for presenting today. And Elias will be back with Eamon presenting tomorrow on the risk-based capital components, followed by a case study on capital requirements. And so, Simone, Jules, you're welcome to join us tomorrow as well and help us out with the breakout groups. Anything I'm forgetting?
Thank you for the invitation.
No, sorry. No, I think that's it for a wrap up. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thanks everybody. I hope it was useful, and thanks for the questions.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Thank you. And go check out your YouTube playlist that Dunya posted earlier in the chat for people who came late.
Okay.
Been compiled.
Bye. Bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.